With the Las Vegas mass shooting and the Texas church shootings, there's been increased call for stricter gun control. To chat a little bit more about it is our Bridge City News contributor, Paul Arthur. Paul, it's not just Democrats, but even Republicans are saying, you know, we have to get our act together here.
Yeah, traditionally Republicans are not for gun control, but I think just the sheer number of deaths that have happened here, and of course so tragic with the kids being killed as well.
8 children died as well.
Yeah, it really
Texas.
makes you think. We have to do something to stop this, to reduce it. Question is, what works? Stricter gun control naturally comes up as part of the conversation. Maybe it's part of the solution. I'm not sure that it would necessarily have worked in these cases when you look at both of the shooters. You know, if they really want to get their guns, yes, they can get their guns, either on the black market or stealing them from somewhere. It's pretty hard to stop somebody from getting a gun if they're absolutely intent on inflicting evil.
And you know what? It's not so much the stricter gun laws when it comes to, let's say, a farmer or rancher who's got a shotgun or a .22 caliber rifle. No, we're talking about semi-automatic or automatic weapons. How was a guy who was dishonorably discharged from the Air Force, because of domestic abuse case, able to get a hold of an AK-47?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Was that the black market, or did he just walk in and say, I'll buy this, and yeah, no problem, here you go?
Yeah, the types of weapons, I guess, can be part of this conversation as well. Of course, you don't have as many of them here in Canada. In the States, you have lots of them. But an interesting argument coming out of that whole deal, too, of course, with the Texas church shooting example, the guy who actually intervened, the neighbor across the street, very interesting to hear his side of the story. He grabbed not a pistol, but an AR-15, the same weapon the shooter was using. He says, well, first of all, if he didn't have that weapon, he wouldn't be able to shoot through the Kevlar. The shooter, of course, had all kinds of equipment on to prevent himself from being shot, but with this particular weapon, he was able to shoot through the body armor and actually injure him to the point where he was fleeing, of course, and ended up crashing, being pursued and so forth, and then he took his own life by shooting himself. But the intervention here with the AR-15 is what stopped it.
So let me ask you, do we need to have maybe stricter security or maybe even armed security guards at churches, at schools, at concerts? Would that help? Maybe more guns?
Yeah.
Instead of less guns?
Right. Well, some people might say fight fire with fire, right? And it's hard for us to imagine having, armed security in Canadian churches. But in the States, it's pretty interesting because these kinds of violent incidents are on the increase. In fact, there's actually a guy who keeps some stats on this here. Trying to find his name here. He used to work for the Focus on the Family Church Security, and his name is Carl Chin. He's tracked the data on deadly force incidents at faith-based organizations in America. And from 1999 to 2017, a total of 1,617 incidents. That's a lot. Back in 1999, there were 10. Compared to a high of 248 in 2015. So this is something that's not going away. It is definitely on the increase.
U.S. President Donald Trump came out and said, we don't have a gun problem in our country, we have a mental health problem. We have mental health problems here in Canada, you have them in Japan, you have them in Germany, other countries around the world. But we don't see the gun violence, the mass shootings like we do in the United States, Paul.
Well, that's an interesting thing. Do we or don't we? I did a little research on this because that's the normal thing that we say. This only happens in America, right? Because, of course, lots of publicity. There are next door neighbor here and so forth. But I looked at some of the research on this here. France, for example, compared to America, we don't see France as being a gun-crazy nation like the U.S., right? Well, their per capita rate, I think a lot of this you need to get boiled down to comparing apples to apples. Per capita rate of casualties is 5 times higher than the rate in the U.S. Yet France does have much stricter gun controls, and the same can be said for numerous other European nations. Again, higher per capita rates of casualties with gun violence as compared to the U.S., and yet stricter, gun control. So, what's causing this?
Maybe some of the refugees, when Europe opened up the doors and say, "Come on in," because I talked to a lot of my family in Europe, and they say, "You know what? The crime has gone up exponentially since we didn't properly vet a lot of the refugees that came in. Jihadists posing as refugees, and they're using guns. So
well, certain
maybe that
countries
contributes to it, right?
Certain countries have a different moral climate, different norms of what's acceptable, what is not. So I guess that's a possibility to consider as well. You know, does it have something to do with high rates of immigration from immoral countries, I suppose? And that's a good question, though. I mean, what is the cause behind this? I mean, is it just more guns that causes this? I don't think that's necessarily the case, but certainly it has to do something with the mindset. Again, maybe higher rates of mental illness is a possibility, so forth. I think part of it might be a lack of respect for human life in some nations, for example, the moral climate there.
So people will kill people.
Yeah,
regardless.
absolutely. Yeah.
You take away the gun, they say, okay, I'm going to use a knife. Take away the knife, to say, well, I'll use something else. A spoon. Well, no, I'm just,
well,
I'm just
you
saying,
know,
a rope, whatever. I mean, if somebody
that's
wants
right.
to kill you bad enough, I mean, they'll find a resource, they'll find a weapon.
Certainly
right?
are other
a blunt
methods.
instrument, a shovel,
Yes.
whatever. I mean, don't give you any ideas at home here, but you know.
Right. Well, you know, you look at too, where does the violence happen? And often in certain communities within a city, for example, and of course around metropolitan centers, there's higher rates of violent murders and so forth. That seems to come with the territory. I think part of it is gang violence. It can be related to addictions, for example. Broken families are certainly part of it. When you look at the incarceration rates and how many of these individuals don't have a father involved in their life, that's a consistent statistic we see, you know, across Europe, across North America.
Some people believe tougher sentencing may help as well, curtail a lot of the violence. But I don't know, because especially in the United States, these guys, sometimes they're just on a rampage. It's a suicide mission. They don't expect to live. You know?
Right,
So they don't
right.
really care about, okay, throw me away for 5 life sentences in the United States.
And yet there may be an argument to be made when you look at some of the countries where they have much lower rates of violence, Japan, for example, Singapore even, right? They do have tougher sentencing for violent crime. And I think they also do have less guns. So there's, I guess, 2 sides to that as well.
How about capital punishment?
Yeah, that's a great question. Of course, we don't have that in Canada now for a long time. Although, interestingly enough, I've seen some of the latest survey I saw done on this. It's been a number of years now, but it was still 61, 63%, something like that. It was almost 2/3 of Canadians were in favor of seeing a return to capital punishment for certain types of murders. So
What was the reasoning behind that?
it's just a common sense, I think, response when we see, you know, innocent children murdered, when we see police officers murdered. It's premeditated murders, not second-degree murder. We're talking first-degree premeditated violent murder, mass murders, these kinds of things. Canadians say, you know what, enough is enough. Let's put an end to it. Let's have a serious consequence rather than, you know, somebody's out again in 10 years and perhaps repeats the crime.
So what percentage of homicides in Canada are specifically with guns?
You know, it was roughly around 1/3 when I looked at the stats on that. So not as high as you might expect. So as a fairly high rate, of course, of stabbings. People, you know, use their hands to kill people. They run them over with cars. There's various ways of killing people, of course. But yeah, only about 1/3. I mean, I shouldn't say only. It's pretty bad as it is that way. But yeah.
So when I worked in Parliament Hill, the NDP was quite adamant about the discussion of a long gun registry. Again, the Liberals, the same thing. The Tories shut down the idea. And the reason why a lot of the Conservative MPs said no is specifically because it's not the farmers and the ranchers you have to be concerned about. It's these people getting guns or automatic weapons on the black market, you know, illegally bringing them in. Responsible gun owners are the ones you should be concerned about.
Absolutely. It's not the guys who've gone out of their way to get the training, first of all, right? They've gone through all the proper checks. They've had their mental health checks, right? I'm a gun owner. You had to get some references. Is this person's, you know, mental health stable, yes or no, and so forth. You know, these guys aren't the ones who are likely to go and blow away somebody just for the heck of it. Now, these are the people who are already an evil mindset in place. They're going to get it on the black market. So any kind of a gun control thing is not going to stop them from doing what they're going to do.
So how about in the United States? Do you think maybe they should, instead of just applying for a permit, maybe look into mental health background checks on a lot of these applicants?
I think there has to be serious attention given to the mental health of an individual wanting to buy not just a handgun, let's say, again, an AK-47 sort of thing or an AR-15, these are potential, weapons of mass destruction, right, if you will. And so something has to be done. There needs to be a longer wait time, I think, as well. We shouldn't be in a rush to give people, weapons that way. Let's make sure we do a really, really thorough job. I'm not for big government intervention, okay? I think people need to be able to, defend their homes if they want, or to be sport shooters and so forth. But let's do the thorough check.
A lot of American friends that I speak with, they say, well, it's our constitutional right to bear arms. We have open carry.
Yep.
I've seen guys walk right into a Walmart in Phoenix, Arizona with a, sidearm. You see that in Florida as well, and it blows my mind. And some people say, well, it takes away a lot of the road rage. You won't see as many people, because if somebody pulls a .357 Magnum, guy's got a .38 Special, it's like, okay, that's fine. But they say we have a right to bear arms, but that goes back to the 1800s when the government was going to take away your land. We're going to protect ourselves, you're not taking our land. That's not really happening today.
Yeah, no, in that sense, is the government going to come and, put us all in jail, for example, for, some reason? No, I don't think that's the case. But there is something to be said, especially in the States. They have a different constitution than we do, and they have the constitutional right to bear arms. So, and they're going to fight for that, and I don't think we're going to see that go away anytime soon. Here in Canada, in some ways, I do wish they would loosen up a little bit. I wonder sometimes, if we did have more, guns in homes, would there be a bit of a deterrent for some of the bad guys? In Switzerland, for example, of course, a lot of the people there do have guns. They have like a kind of a standby militia, if you will, right? The people 18 have mandatory service in the armed forces, and they're trained with the guns. They keep them at home and so forth. Actually, I saw some stats on that too, very interesting. For example, 15.5% of Canadian households owned firearms. And then 29% of households in Switzerland with firearms. Their murder rate, 0.49 per 100,000. Canada, 1.56 per 100,000, 3 times the rate. But we have, fewer, guns available. So fascinating too. Colombia has a gun ownership rate of 5.9%, a lot lower, and a firearm homicide rate of 27 per 100,000.
Well, there are cartels in Colombia too that we have to.
Yes, so there's so many other
right?
factors that come into play here. Again, so much has to do with the mindset. One thing we should maybe touch base on here too is even violent media. Boy.
You mean Hollywood? Like Hollywood movies glorifying shooting, explosions. There are also video games too, like Grand Theft Auto.
Right.
I remember many years ago when I was working as a story chase producer with CTV National, and we talked about in Vancouver how the police wanted to see that taken off all of the store shelves, Grand Theft Auto, because it encourages violence and shooting police officers.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it has been banned in some countries, Well, I can see why. Again, young people, of course, their minds, highly, they're like sponges, right? You can influence them that way. Yeah. And you got somebody coming from a broken family. They've seen maybe violence in their own home, that sort of thing.
So does it start at home then? Maybe when the kids are young?
Well, I think that does have something to do as well. Broken families certainly
Right.
contribute to that big time, right? What example has been set for them? And now when you have this again, doubly influenced now through media, if you're saturated with that and you see violence, you become kind of normalized with this, right? And in fact, it's almost... Now we're seeing kids who are cheering for the bad guy. Used to be, it was clearly the good guy. We want to see them
Look
win.
for the white cowboy hat. That's the good guy. That's what you're cheering for, not the black cowboy hat.
We see somebody like Deadpool, for example, a hugely violent superhero.
Anti-hero, maybe.
Is this where we want to go? I'd love to see some of that change. We need better media out there,
We've only got a couple of minutes left here, but one thing I wanted to touch base as well, Paul, is the special interest groups, the lobby groups in the United States, like the NRA, heavily embedded with the Republican Party. They've, they basically donated millions upon millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to a lot of campaigns for a lot of Republicans. So how do you kind of disconnect the two? When you have these special lobby and interest groups who are supporting one party more than another party. You don't want to say no to all of that money. As a party, you need it. But at the same time,
the National Rifle Association has a huge influence on this.
Oh, yeah.
Money does have a part to play in this. It's unfortunate. Politics has a part to play in this. And again, I can see both sides. I've seen some of the stats again. When you look at Japan, the UK, less firearms, less violence, right, in some ways. And yet you see other stats saying, hey, you know what, more guns. Now you see fewer carjackings, these kinds of things. Both sides have something to say here. We've got to somehow be able to compromise some and say, let's meet in the middle somewhere here. We all want to see less violent deaths, especially for our young people.
How about keep the
so-
automatic weapons with the military,
Yeah.
that you can have your shotguns
Yeah.
and your handguns, right?
That's not a bad idea. I wonder sometimes, do we really need, again, these semi-automatic AK-47s, AR-15s, and so forth? I'm not sure that we do. We don't typically hunt with them, so that might be part of the solution here as well. Better mental health, better checks for some of these things as well. And, I think a lot of this has to do, again, with the moral climate, if you really come down to it. Again, is there can I say it, a fear of God? A respect for human life, for our neighbor. We might come from different religious backgrounds, non-religious backgrounds, but there needs to be a respect for human life that needs to return. Part of this, again, comes back to our media that we touched on here as well. Something needs to change. And church security, just one quick thing here too. Again, do we need it here in Canada? We might say no, but you know what? As soon as we get some of these violent things happening in Canadian churches, we might change our tune here as well. Some of the American churches do have armed security officers. A lot of times they'll have like a retired or an off-duty police officer who knows their stuff, and they are on the usher team, but not every church has access to that. But somehow we have to get a plan in place, I believe, for our churches. If something happens, how are we going to respond?
That's true, very true. Paul Arthur, BCN contributor, thanks again for your time.
You bet.